This is Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. Future Sense Now is brought to you by the Futures Forum. Stay tuned for a journey to the future.
All right, greetings and salutation, friends and family, colleagues, and those who I do not yet know. You are still in the category of potential friend and family, and certainly, hopefully, an ally on our journey to creating zoetic futures. Today is UN International Human Solidarity Day. It's quite a day, and I'm excited to participate in this conversation about addressing the question, how do we think about the future of human solidarity in an AI-enabled world? This is really the question I've been asking for some time. And here we are having a conversation. We've had a really interesting morning. We have been speaking with, we began with Deepa Naik, a young lady I met during the height of COVID. She used to be active in Humans for AI. In fact, she was a co-founder of Humans for AI, and she's very active doing with responsible AI in India. And I thought it important to speak to somebody who comes from a very ancient civilization and whose religious perspective is very different. So solidarity means something very different in Indian culture. We then moved to a young voice. I very rarely speak to people that young, but I was very intrigued. He's 30 under 30 on some list or another. And he's Nigerian, although he's here in the United States of America, but he works on human AI interaction. And I thought it'd be nice to hear what this generation that are sort of, I would say, native to this concept of AI, hear what they have to say. And then I went back to another colleague friend who I met also in the middle of COVID. I met a lot of fantastic people in COVID. And she's Dr. Rebecca Hardcastle Wright, and she's the founder of the Institute for Extra Consciousness. And that community really is about trying to warn people about, or at least prepare people that the transhumanist agenda of brain-machine interface may actually take away a lot of our humanness. There's a human cognitive skills that we're not aware of. Some people are gifted with the ability to see beyond what the normal would see, and those people are often misunderstood. They're laughed at, they're ridiculed, which is not so bad because back in the older days they were burnt at the stake. Yeah. So at least we allow them the ability to be different. And so we want to close out this session with Samar Younes, who I met at the Dubai Futures Forum a couple of years ago. And she's an artist, theorist, designer, futurist. I like to just call her a transcultural futurist, operating between Beirut and Brooklyn, two very interesting and dynamic spaces. One, Beirut, of course, is from an ancient culture. I mean, Lebanon is one of the places you hear about in the Bible, right? And Brooklyn, of course, is new. It's less than 300 years old. She's founder of Samar Ritual, an architect of a philosophical construction that she calls quantum craft, a low-tech insurgent method for high-tech futures that centers solidarity through what she calls Silk Road reciprocity. So this I really have to hear about. She talks about multicultural enrichment as opposed to a structured model of economy and the way we view the world. And is very much in her artist phase, creating future ancestors' artifacts. And this allows us to have temporal protection, right? And protocols and cultural archaeology that explores kinship across the generations, which is important. This is part of what the UN Pact for the Future is talking about, future generations. How do we have intergenerational respect and honoring, etc.? And of course, knowledge systems. So welcome, Samar Younes, to help me close out my exploration. Thank you for participating in what I call my own personal school, right? We have gone through the habit now of going to the internet for information and knowledge. And so I use these opportunities and dialogues of a way of educating myself without resorting to the search engine or AI itself. I want to hear it from the horse's mouth, not filtered through the lens of an algorithm. So, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you every time.
Yes, it's a pleasure for me to have you here as well. So, I have so many questions, I almost don't know where to start, but I am going to try to start with the question around what does solidarity mean in the future, where the goal is the flourishing of all life, not just human survival?
Yeah, I mean, to me, and this goes to the question you were interested about, because solidarity to me, as far as my framing, is what I call Silk Road reciprocity, which is this idea of how can you create this layered mutual enrichment network versus an extraction protocol like colonialism has done for so many years. Before colonialism, and how a lot of like knowledge and culture kind of mutated and traveled was through trade, and it was a Silk Road trade, and trade exchanged a lot of element from that particular culture. If you think all the way back to my ancient ancestors, which are the Phoenicians, the traders, they understood something very deeply, which is the idea of cultural pollinization. They invented the color purple from shells. So their affinity with like nature, and even invented the first boats, like being able to navigate the seas, the ocean, but doing it in ways that really is enriched all participant, and also wherever they arrived and wherever they traveled, it was all about this kind of zero sum game competition. It was about accumulation without assimilation. So, how can we shift in my head with this framework the idea that human survival, it's an all life flourishing, where the solidarity that we're talking about requires recognizing the intelligence across all species. So whether that ecosystem or different generation, it means making decisions as though rivers, forests, descendants all have voting rights equally.
Well, actually, that's what I was thinking to come to. But before I get to that conversation about this principle, I actually have found a fabulous word, Ukama, Ukama. It's a
Hmm.
Zulu word, and it kind of extends the concept of Ubuntu, which is about I am because you are, and it's a very human construct, to Ukama, which is about all human, all life, right? But before I get to that, I want to go back to what you said about trade,
Hmm.
and trade that was, let's say, pre the transatlantic slave trade and
Yep.
colonial experiment between, let's say, 1490 something and whenever it stopped in the 19th century, more or less.
Yep.
Um, and so what I think I understand you to say is that solidarity between humans and some might argue that solidarity didn't exist in that frame because there were so many wars. There were
Hmm.
always people capturing people. The Romans captured this, so there's always been a humanity has always been a state of like, let us conquer something. But what I hear you trying to saying that, yes, but it was not at the same scale, if you will, of what we have endured in the last 500 years. And maybe that endure is the wrong word, because I like to always think that not everything we got was right, but the fact is, this is where we are now. So this is what we have to work with. But then how do we continue to evolve as a species? But you're quite right when you say that we as humans have to understand we're not in this world alone. And so I
Hmm.
want to ask you now to bring this conversation on how does solidarity then extend? How do we then as humans begin to have people understand that we are interdisciplinary and interdependent with Insects, I mean, we hate them because they're bugs, but again, if we didn't have them, we may not have certain food. We may not have certain birds. We may not have certain, other things that we love. How do we really get people to understand that we have to find a new way of becoming and being in order to survive our genius? Because our genius, I think, has now brought us to the brink of self extinction.
Absolutely. And this is why I love the idea of accumulation and mutation, because oftentimes we think in a very binary state. And the reason why, the philosophy quantum craft that I sort of, have been developing, which I'll talk about later, is the idea of this cultural reciprocity, but also cultural complexity. In an age where a lot of everything that we're doing is causing more and more severance, but it's also causing more monoculture. When I say severance, is like how the machine has constantly made us become more like machine. I always say I'm less worried about us becoming, you know, uh I'm less worried about the machine taking over us becoming human, because our complexity is not as easily engineered unless we are becoming more like machine. And what has become is us becoming more like machine because we are, you know bounded by what the machine wants us to, how it wants us to show up, and we obey. We basically voluntarily became tokens. We voluntarily became, hashtag. We voluntarily became in boxes, being able to labeled and to be able to be sorted very easily through these algorithm, and be able to be surfaced based on how the algorithm wants us to show up, when it wants us to show up, the frequency it wants us to show up. But this idea of becoming more like machine is beyond just, how things are labeled. And that's, I want to give the context of how solidarity plays into this, because the idea of us being more severed is a long-term engineering of making us more disconnected from one another,
Mhm.
disconnected, like, perpetuating loneliness and perpetuating idea of egocentrism, and also the ideas of us needing ourselves alone to survive and be good in the world. It's the same idea of disconnect and dismemberment and severance from our bodies, and not being able to be within our body. It's the same idea in severance, to be disconnected from our land. So every single social construct has been engineered to more and more make us completely fragmented. And this fragmentation create dissonance. When you basically are fragmented, you're less likely to be empathetic to things that are happening around the world that are catastrophic, and
Mhm.
where there is things like, natural disasters, genocides, absolute, and utter kind of disastrous situation that requires solidarity, where we don't necessarily respond the same way because we have been so severed, and our survival depend on us chasing and becoming more, in a relationship to this machine, and based on what the machine requires us to be in order for us to be able to survive and succeed and make a living. And this is where the biggest issue is when it comes to, you know, technology and futures. Because otherwise, to me, technology can also be an incredible source of liberation as well as solidarity in many different ways. If I
Yes.
want to give you like a bit of like a lived experience, scenario, when we talk about like how does it mean to live in the solidarity. I grew up, in Beirut during the civil war and during many wars. I was there through my early 20s, and survival depended on these distributed network. It wasn't about severance. And it wasn't about centralized powers. It's about where these infrastructure fails you, when all these things that are coming from the top down fail you, and there is like chaos. It's the neighbor to neighbor solidarity that made many
Mm.
people survive many wars. It's what keep people alive, whether it's sharing resources, sharing water, sharing generator, sharing food, sharing ways to take care of each other's elders or each other's kids, sharing candles when, electricity wasn't available, or, offering to kind of tag team on how to cook. That's what solidarity looked like as a daily practice. It wasn't a policy abstraction. Um,
I don't want to jump in right there because I I want you to now juxtapose that, right,
mm,
against our experience in COVID.
right. Exactly. Which shared a lot of this. Basically, our experience in COVID was, to me, in two ways. It was the ultimate severance. I don't know if you know that show Severance, which is also a very kind of almost a foresight into like a very terrifying future where, it showed how somebody implants the chips where they go to work and they don't recognize anything of their life outside of work. So within the work, whatever happens at work, they don't remember when they leave work. So the idea of disconnect is so obviously this is like a very dystopian idea of what severance is. But when we talk about severance and the idea of us being disconnected from each other, which is the antithesis of being human, COVID was the ultimate experiment of that. How can we sever people the most possible and isolate them in ways that there is no way they can survive, because we depend on each other for survival. And the more there is like a way to create this kind of codependence on machine and on technology, and and non-dependence on each other, or ideas, or sort of, you know lies about, the fact that we don't depend on each other as well as the planet and everything else for our livelihood. The more it is it succeeds in the plan of having people take over systems and create more billionaires and people on the top, and that's how it is.
I really like this idea of really talking about this in the real sense, not just the theoretical sense of it, because as I'm thinking through this, what does it look like? Just to add on to your thing about the neighbor versus COVID, where you really didn't even talk to your neighbor because you just had to dash in and dash out, and looking at this idea of severance and how it is now, you go to the store and it's just machines, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And people kind of wonder why. Like always say, I don't go to those machines, my dear. I go to the person, and they be
Mm-hmm.
like, "Why is it so much easier?" I'm like, "No, for me." I resent the fact that I have to actually check my groceries because I feel like that is one of the things I'm paying for. Do not have to do, number one. Number two, I'm also concerned about if I go to that machine, there are now three people who are working the cash registers. Somebody's going to lose their job if I am one of the people who go to the machine. So if
Mm-hmm.
I go there and stand in the line and wait, even though the machines are free, right?
Yep.
I am helping that person to keep that job. So that is my
Mm-hmm.
little thing for the day. And then I think about it and I say, and then my third point is that I'm worried about right now, for example, I live with somebody, right? But let's say I end up, as I get older, not living with anybody. And the
Mm-hmm.
only humans I'm going to meet is to go out every day to the post office or to go to the bank or to go to the supermarket just to say, hi, how are you? And then this person, Ned or Jed or whomever knows me. And then you take away Ned and Jed. Are you telling me I'm not going to be by myself, not even to have a grocery store bagger to know me by name? I don't think I want to live in that world.
But this is what goes back to trade and Silk Road reciprocity. I would extend this beyond where you're not going to the store to use the machine and you're standing in line. But what if you're also going to the mom and pop store versus the store that might install the machine, and the same idea? Because this is where most relationships are cultivated. And if we want to perpetuate ideas of severance, meaning we are literally emphasizing monocultural takeover versus ideas of reciprocity, which is mutual enrichment. You're unable to learn and enrich from each other, or even empathize and expand through human connection, if you don't create the opportunity for the
Human,
sucrose enrichment, right?
yeah,
And
yeah, and it's fantastic because I'm hearing that reciprocity. So in my Smart Futures framework, I talk about the process of design thinking, but they're the values. And the S in SMART for me is solidarity, and the R in SMART is reciprocity, and the M in SMART is mutuality, and the A in SMART is altruism, and the T is trust. So if we don't have human interactions, you're not going to be able to develop those. And so what everything you're saying is sort of is resonating with me in a way, especially when you brought it from the theory of it to the how is it lived.
right.
So let's go back to the question then. So how does solidarity, if we're able to be intentional about practicing it and helping our friends and families practice it, make one thing a day, ensure that future generations, right, the displaced or dispossessed peoples, as well as those living systems we talked about, the rivers, the forests, the seas, are represented in the decisions that are made today, the policy decisions, the business decisions that are being made, that let's say we don't have direct control over, but we may be able to have indirect input into shaping.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think this is where I see like the biggest gap, because most decision making structures, at least that we are aware of to date, do not have the mechanism for this. They have good intention and platitude, but they don't have actual representation for all these different things to incur. What we have like witnessed, or at least from a sort of creative work perspective in my creative practice, or when organizations include community members in actual design decisions, for example, not just feedback session but voting power or resource allocation. And that goes, to many different companies or small businesses that have been run by, people that are within my circle. It's the same. You see different outcome when these people have voting power, or even have a share. They are equal shareholders of the business, like a business model that where everybody has equal share versus an employee changes the entire dynamic of a business, because you're not asking anymore people to give their opinion, and those people, why would they want to invest as much and be as active if the infrastructure is not really there is no reciprocity to them in the same way. So not asking like displaced people what they think, after the decision is made, but asking them to give like their decision making authority from the beginning. So we're
Yes.
talking about, this could be when we're talking about people who have just incur a catastrophe or a disaster, victims of wars, victims of displacement, but also people who within any sort of infrastructure, any company, any policy, or human resources manual that's sort of written for any company should operate in that sense.
One of the organizations I have been salivating to get into and to learn more about is Mondragon.
Mm-hmm.
It's the largest cooperative in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And with Jamaica's devastation, another reason why I decided to do this conversation series, I've been just looking at the images of Jamaica, where I was born and spent my formative years in high school, and saying, my God, how are we going to really rebuild? This is not just a regular hurricane where you have a few roofs blown off. This is like
Right.
entire villages. A
Right.
lot of our culture, to come back to the issue of culture, this church is over 100 years old, decimated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so how do we really, as diaspora, engage in a solidarity economics to help the people at the base, those farmers, those fisher folk, were not going to be at the table when the government is making those decisions. But
Absolutely.
as diaspora who are involved in sending home remittances and have a
Hmm.
little bit more access to power structure, how can we actually understand what solidarity looks like? And it's not just the rebuilding of the home, it's also how do we ensure some of the cultural spaces that were lost, we are even capturing them in stories. And I'm saying maybe I can at least start a story core or something that I can do without having to get permission, if that makes sense. Because I'm so terrified that a whole generation of people will not know so much of our history because they've been obliterated.
Yeah, they've been obliterated, but also they've been severed, and they have been completely grandfathered and adopted very passionately and wholeheartedly, and voluntarily, consumption culture. They are basically living, breathing, and purposely feeding consumption culture in any way, shape, or form. And if I want to think through like an essential framework, how can we kind of create the solidarity framework where there is this representation in the decision made today? If I want to think of like grandma, she probably didn't have like the formal idea of what we call the seven generation thinking, but she operated in that way, right? She would sew clothes, and she was self-taught, but every piece that she did was designed to be like altered, passed down, remade. It wasn't about, you're buying something off the rack and you're consuming it, and then because it's poorly made or however it's made, it's going to be thrown out, and you're going to have to ship it and do whatever it is. And there was so much detail, so much within each piece that she created that were so special, like that you didn't even have the heart to not you know pass it down or remake it or alter it. So it wasn't necessarily planned, but the idea of seven generation thinking should sort of be across so many different touch point, and the framework of many things that we can look at. And that's sort of is a premise of a lot of my future ancestor, when I like kind of work through the theory of it, but also the manifestation and the artifact. What I don't see enough of, oftentimes, is formal infrastructure where these ecosystems of future, ancestor, future generations, displaced community have more of this binding power, not just advisory role, because we do have a lot of token and these advisory role that happen all the time, where they just want to put tokens in the mix to sort of make it seem as though these people have impact, but they don't have binding power. And this is where it's critical to sort of like change the narrative, because I can't sign personally, I can't cite from my experience specific policy example, because honestly they're also very rare and I haven't studied them deeply. But the absence of those being so clearly and available to us is very telling, because if otherwise they would be very easily quoted. And I feel like, there is many ways one can explore that, and how can they explore it on a personal level. But one of the most important thing is having the awareness of it. And every decision that you make, being super aware in order for you to move accordingly. How I do this awareness in my practice, which is mostly culture production, is how can I develop this future ancestor method where I'm asking what would the descendant need from us? Not as though, experiment, but as actual constraint on what somebody creates. Because that allows you to sort of rethink about, how you're exploring um, things through your personal practice. Mine is a creative practice that, and how can you sort of do it through your own practice to create the mechanism to have the binding decision makers very much embedded in the infrastructure of anything that you do.
Well, I wanted to say, I'm just thinking, I'm hearing and I'm thinking, because this is I really want to have some, let's say, maybe something I can do to relieve my anxiety about what could go wrong in the reconstruction and redevelopment of Jamaica post Hurricane Melissa. And as I'm looking at this idea of future artifacts, I'm thinking about all those churches that were built, some of them in the early 20th century, 80 years old, 90 years old, one or two maybe even be in the hundreds. And you know, coming out of the slave holding society, the
Hmm.
Baptist church, the Anglican church, the Moravian churches were where in rural areas, that parish that was damaged, Black River, had
Hmm.
some of the first things in the Western Hemisphere, right? Because
Wow.
it was a very valuable parish to the British, right? So,
Mm.
and it's considered to be the breadbasket of Jamaica today. But as I think about the trauma people have faced, I'm thinking about, before I get into the life centered governance, to go back to the cultural artifacts, is if, you know, just again with what we can do, because we can't compel the government to do anything, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
maybe through the hometown associations, the diaspora have, some of them are active in alumni associations, some of them are active in their churches back home.
Hmm.
Is there maybe could story capture be a way of creating a, I mean, it would be a historical artifact, but at least something we could tape and hold for the future. So people who were not there, like people would have lost photographs anyway. But if people actually even recovered some of those things from their mess, is there some sort of a that we can think about that can be done without any funding? Because if we have to wait until we're funded by somebody, it's not going to happen. I just know this. It has to be something that we can do with limited amount of money. We can say, okay, to everybody, here's a space to put any old photographs, scan them in and dump them. And when you have time, go in and write the story. So we don't lose all of our history, because the buildings are going to be, the remnants of the buildings are going to be torn down.
Right. And this is where technology, if it's used around solidarity and empowerment and for provenance purposes, and also as the super mycelium knowledge network, almost like Silk Road 2.0, where it's not only capturing what might be disseminating or forcefully disappeared, or violently or indirectly through non-human intervention, as well as planetary intervention, as for, the disaster that might occur. How can we safeguard these fragments of our culture, be it through environmental, be it architectural, be it vernacular, be it anything that sort of really creates importance, and doesn't remove these pieces of the puzzle that are part of our lineage, because when they are severed or like removed from the equation, we are missing pieces of the puzzle that are critical for how we move and operate, because every layer is as equally important to our survival, but also this accumulation is literally our DNA, and is the thing that link us to each other and keep us grounded to our humanity. So there are ecosystems in which I think a lot of communities that are have been displaced right now, or through natural disasters or war, have created already to safeguard destructed places, whether those places has personal meaningful things, or historically relevant or culturally relevant, by either capturing them through imaging, through 3D scanning. Like now technology makes it so accessible for you to scan virtually anything, even 3D scan something that might be leaving or kind of dissipating, and to be able to replicate it and sort of recreate a virtual version of it. Even like the idea of our brain doesn't always need, um because neuroplasticity gives you the ability to look into experiences, even if they're virtual, you're able to capture certain ones and understand them better than not having any at all. And being able to build some of those library of dissipated and disappearing things, it happens a lot in places where culture has been destroyed. Um, the idea of also photograph is a great thing, video and audio capture is a great thing, but all of which can train, models, and enables us to use AI to be like mycelium, being able to not only be a safeguard and this hyper library, but be able to help us connect the dot of not having these missing links when they do go missing, in order
Yeah,
to create a better framework for this mycelium ecosystem, that
yeah.
allows us to partner primitive, technologies with future technologies to create better future inter-exchange and better layering and complexity in terms of our lived experience.
Yeah. So from then, what does life-centered governance rooted in solidarity look like then in this period of rapid change and uncertainty? You were there in Brooklyn. You just had a major, um, I guess, upset, if you will, in the political establishment, and a lot of promises were made. I'm like, I didn't say it was going to work, but actually, maybe an opportunity for some of these. Ideas that have been filtered on in terms of participatory democracy, for solidarity to be expressed in the way the governance structures run in different ways. I know we have a huge social network system in New York in particular, but in those cases, much of that is part of people's paid work, more so than people the neighbor that is really the neighbor. But from your perspective, thinking about life-centered governance, right, rooted in solidarity, noting that we can't get away from the fact that we're also data sets, right? Of
Yes.
everything.
Yeah,
We're,
yeah,
we're,
absolutely.
we're a social security number, we're a driver's license number, and we're a phone number. There are three numbers that govern our lives. Those three numbers, if you live in the United States of America, right? So, what would a life-centered governance to root in solidarity look like in this period of really rapid change and uncertainty? Because we're living in America, and every day is a new story.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I do feel who really worked through culture complexity and in the cracks, not through machine. They use the machine and they use the algorithm to their advantage in ways that is as an insurgent on the sort of machine, which is very much, a quantum craft method. Because when I talk about insurgent, meaning you need to use technology because you have no choice. But how can you utilize technology as somebody where you're hacking onto technology versus the other way around? And somebody who did this incredibly well because they centered multiplicity and dignity in their campaign was Zohran Mamdani, who is the incumbent mayor. Because what he did in his campaign and throughout his campaign really well was that he didn't choose to do a campaign being centered and for the top major players in the city. What he did is he went underground in the cracks and really went in a very human, connective way to the folks that are completely invisible, the folks that don't necessarily people give them a time of day, whether it's the people that work overnight, the taxi driver. He literally canvassed every borough you can imagine, talking to the people. It was almost like an archetype of what does that look like when we are creating this multiplicity and reciprocity, where we are having conversation between different cultures, between different people, and not being okay with the status quo of what's happening in Washington and what's happening in identity politics. It was a complete opposite. It was a very refreshing campaign for that particular reason, but because it operated in the crack and it actually utilized social media to its advantage by creating a storytelling formula that really encouraged and tapped into voters that wouldn't otherwise vote, specifically the
Oh,
youth culture and folks who are not interested in politics because they gave up because it's all completely not inspiring. But also how he's forming now his new government, being able, the idea of bringing people, giving people the right to vote, binding rights to vote, and creating a government where his entire transition team was made by voting power, was made by people who applied, like thousands and thousands of applicant he got to apply, where everybody can be involved. That is completely new. That is an entirely new ecosystem that was
wow.
incredibly refreshing, and it was rooted in solidarity because his tagline was dignity for all, no matter where, what walk of life you are, no matter what culture, no matter what religion. And it was about this being true and true for everybody, not for only the elite and not for, circumstantial or conditional. It was everybody. And it was liberation in the sense that is through a dignified life is very different than liberation through, just talks and identity politics like they have done over the years. And that was a very interesting um campaign that was led, and I think it really showed how life-centered government rooted in solidarity can look like in this rapid time of change.
And I am hearing you and listening to you because, as I said, I am quite concerned about the situation in Jamaica. I look at the situation in Port-au-Prince and
Mm.
I say, if we're not careful, Jamaica could become that because we
Yeah.
have a lot of gangs that are there feeding like wolves and preying on the people who have nothing.
Mm.
And if we're not able to provide a lifeline to the young people in particular, then they're easily preyed upon to join that other life. And so I feel as if to say, we in the diaspora again who are concerned about our hometowns, our communities, our churches, our schools, have to come with a different. It's not enough to send home a barrel of food anymore. It's not enough to send home a suitcase of clothing anymore. We have to really think about how are we going to be different in challenging the assumptions of status quo politics, right, in the Jamaican context, to
Yep.
address a new way of kinship, right? And it's okay that we don't vote, and probably it's better that we don't vote because then we won't fall into the trap of the binary politics that exists in Jamaica because we don't vote
Hmm.
in terms of physically voting, but we can vote for the people and have the people become the third power as opposed to the politics. And that sounds, it's just what I'm
Exactly.
concerned with. And so when I hear you mention the word quantum craft, I want you to explore it before we go to our last question. Could you just talk a little bit more about what quantum craft is?
Yeah, absolutely. So quantum craft, operate mostly through the three intelligence stream. And the idea of ancestral intelligence, which is like this inherited temporal wisdom, ecological intelligence, which is mycelium network thinking, and artisanal intelligence, which is the embodied material knowledge, like working with your hand. How can you use these three intelligence stream in a kaleidoscopic way to intervene on technology, but also to make decisions and operate in life in general? And in order to do that, you need to think through this particular, intelligence stream, because it's very important to not lose track of all the things that really essentially make us so incredibly powerful as human, and to reconnect from a non-severant way. Why it is an insurgent method is because we as human are naturally insurgent in the sense that we don't we're, if you lose curiosity and imagination and take that out of the human equation, and also our ability to and desire to always want to problem solve, to always want to kind of create better things, and tinker with things, then you're removing a lot of what makes us so special. So when we talk about ancestral intelligence, it's thinking about ourselves through not as you know unique in this world, and with nobody around us, nobody behind us, nobody in front of us. So thinking through that mindset, seven generation thinking and beyond, is extremely important. When you're talking about ecological intelligence, there is something really incredible about future through this ecological intelligence, because you are operating through this mycelium thinking, meaning you are looking into how do you emulate and emphasize and center ecological intelligence. I wrote this piece about how nature was a great example during my stay in Beirut recently, how it sort of was a silent rebellion because it operated through the cracks. You see all these vegetation growing, and not necessarily following structures, because it has its own way to survive and its own way to sort of bring life. So how can we think and operate in this way? And artisanal is very important, which is material intelligence. So working with our head, anything that we touch, anything that we create, anything that we sort of form, is so incredible, because that's where a lot of our creativity becomes and happens. It's not always in our head. And our severance forced us to work very much on the computer most of the time, where we completely lost track of our connection to our body and working with our hands. And when I talk about quantum craft, is our ability to create a better, material digital entanglement, where you're thinking through these intelligence work stream as you're operating, whether you're operating your business, whether you're creating your own thing, whatever you're doing, you're actually thinking through those intelligence system with specific ways, in terms of understanding very fully your unique DNA in order to intervene on these things through this
Yeah.
particular ecosystem.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end, and I want to get this question in. So, thinking a lot about a practical thing, because I really want to do something with this concept of solidarity in the Jamaican context, to help, hopefully, people who are on the ground every day and help us in the diaspora be better allies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what are maybe some shared rituals or some social contracts? Because I'm not going to touch the issue of law, because we can't impact that tomorrow, right? But we
Mm-hmm.
may be able to impact through rituals and through social contracts, working with our alumni associations in our schools, working with our churches. We can create small pockets, and then, that can be built upon, right? So if 5 people do it, and then 5 communities do it, then 50 high schools do it, or 50 schools, all of a sudden we have the groundswell. What ideas might you offer based on your history and your practice and your observations over the last years that might be helpful to embed solidarity in this, let's say, re-architecturing and re-engineering of our Jamaican future? It's very specific. I know you don't
Yeah.
know Jamaican either,
No, but
but you can
yeah.
imagine Beirut with its bombed out areas. Imagine Jamaica with places that look like it has gone through a war.
Of course, no, completely, and I'm familiar enough with Jamaica, but not in the same sense, of course, that you are, and I can offer something very specific, which is to Jamaica and elsewhere, and it's so critical based on my experience, having lived through, war, having been a diaspora, having my husband being Jamaican and spending a lot of time there as well, is thinking that what's necessary to create is provenance protocol. Provenance protocol is a key, not only ritual, but also technology that will sort of serve many countries that are going through a very similar thing. Because provenance protocol is going to create what I call systematic attribution that traces the source, acknowledges the origin, and ensures reciprocity. If we're talking about technologies right now, currently, for instance, AI trains on cultural knowledge without consent or credit, which is a typical colonial extraction, call it consumption culture, it's basically dressed as innovation. But what if, that same kind of technology, and whether it's analog or digital, allows us to create something more of a provenance protocol. So you know from what that looks like as ritual now, we can have a few different ritual that really help, I think, in general and in particular the Jamaican situation, which are like an embodied sensing cultivation, learning to trust our bodies alongside technology. I'm a breast cancer survivor. It is the same, and there is many survivors of whether it's diseases or catastrophes, where machine, for instance, in this case, did catch my cancer accidentally, but it revealed also how disconnected I have become from my own body. So we need, whether it's technology or other sort of forms of ritual that enables us to have more embodied intelligence. And Jamaicans are so incredible with this because they have a natural way to have this embodied sensing cultivation. They're very tapped into so many different things that are very sensorial, from like rhythm to food to a connection to their body that is beyond any other culture. So developing protocol that really connects the body, the mind, and technology is extremely important. The other kind of ritual could be like temporal protection protocol, which is treating every culture output as ancestral technology for its descendant. So, for instance, if my grandmother, for instance, did this garment as heirloom, how can we do this for every protocol that might happen? Because Jamaican culture is one of the most powerful culture across so many different continents. The impact that Jamaican culture have had on culture in general, whether it's like food, music, hairstyles, dress, fashion, has been so incredible. But there is nothing that shows this so clearly, because the Providence Protocol is not in place, to acknowledge the origin, to ensure reciprocity. And also, there is no temporal protection protocol that gives, traces this ancestral technology to its descendant, to understand the roots and to sort of being able to weave what those looks like. So how can we do more attribution practices as part of the ritual within sort of Jamaican culture, just like, we do in different cultures, very specifically more in certain ones than others. For instance, in my work, I try to develop systematic way to credit sources, whether these are ancestral, ecological, or artisanal. So how can we do so by not having individual authorship? And you give that particular call to action to all the artists, all the sort of people that are creating impact or representation in the culture, whether it's athletes, whether it's artists, whether it's academics, whoever it might be in the mix, that really move Jamaican culture in one more way than others. These are the type of people that need to have the systematic way to credit resources and also create more of this Providence Protocol to help the future generation. And it allows us to shift this contract, by exploring the stewardship. So recognizing the borrowed creative capability from future generation and not just extracting them for personal gains. And
Right.
yeah, which is hard because oftentimes the new generation is always so tapped into innovation. But I think there is a big part of the new generation that's really interested in its ancestors, and it's really tracing, and provenance has been a big kind of, I think, maybe inspiration to a lot of youth. And it sort of will give a lot of power if it's done in a very protocolized way, and utilizing different systems and technology to create this legal future framework and policy mechanism that could be put into place and prototyped?
Well, there's a lot of things to think about. I am really going to be probably calling back on you when I even have one entry point, because I believe that this day, as I said, International Human Solidarity Day, most people don't pay it any mind. But having this conversation was important for me, because I've really been thinking, where do we go from here as a nation? So thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me to reflect on this concept of solidarity and transcultural futures, and how countries that are experiencing massive losses, right? Whether it's through man-made disasters or, nature-made disasters, or which could become back to man-made in a circular way. I'm just really grateful to you, Samar Younes, for taking time again, for speaking with me and closing out this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, and wishing you and your audience a happy New Year and a great holiday ahead. Let's hope we can create more inspiring protocols for the future that are grounded in solidarity for all of us.
Yes. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
One love, as we say in Jamaica. One love.
One love. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to Future Sense Now, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please. You have been listening to Future Sense Now, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Thank you for listening. Spread the word. Share the future.